Have you heard what happened to King Charles? No, seriously, pull up a seat, maybe grab a cup of tea, because this one isn't your typical royal headline. This is the kind of news that sends a ripple through the palace corridors, halts conversations mid-sentence, and makes even casual monarchy followers whisper, "Wait, what?" Picture this. Physicians speaking in hushed clinical tones, aides trading tense glances over folders thick with medical jargon, and a king who spent his life waiting to ascend a throne now facing something even crowns can't conquer, an illness labeled no cure. And it's taken a visible toll. The once tireless royal itinerary now has subtle gaps. The familiar composed smile, still there, but weighed down by something heavier than duty. But before we march straight into the gloom, let's unpack this in a way that makes sense, royal confusion and all. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. When the diagnosis hits harder than a tabloid scoop. Let's be honest, the royals have weathered scandals involving leaked conversations, public family feuds, documentaries, tell-all books, eyebrow-raising interviews, and more speculative narratives than Shakespeare ever drafted. But a confirmed chronic illness with no cure? That's not drama. That's reality. And reality, as it turns out, has absolutely no respect for titles. Charles's health journey has always been a well-monitored dance between genetics, age, lifestyle, and relentless public obligations. We associate him with rituals, speeches, sustainability campaigns, architectural critiques, classic cars that probably have stronger bones than most of us, and a work ethic that had put entrepreneurs to shame. Yet, even fueled by organic farming and environmental zeal, the human body sometimes draws a line and says, "Not today, Your Majesty." The devastating part? Some conditions simply don't have a fix-it button, not even a diamond-embellished royal one. And the phrase, "nightmare taking a toll," feels painfully accurate, because chronic illness doesn't arrive like a villain in armor. It tiptoes in like an uninvited house guest, quietly rearranging your life, schedule, stamina, mood, sleep patterns, even appetite for things like, say, 17th public engagement of the month. But what illness are we actually talking about here? Well, that's where things get even more unsettling. The invisible battle, what no cure really means. Medical language is brutal in its honesty. No cure doesn't necessarily mean immediate catastrophe, but it does mean one thing. This fight doesn't end, it adapts. Unlike infections where antibiotics swoop in like superheroes, or injuries where rest and physiotherapy play the healing orchestra, no-cure illnesses are more like stealth missions. Management becomes the strategy, not elimination. These fall into broad categories. Autoimmune disorders, when your body decides it's auditioning for internal civil war. Degenerative diseases, aka the slow fade your doctor describes like a tragic movie narrator. Genetic syndromes, where DNA throws its own surprise twists. Neurological conditions, when wiring gets glitchy. Systemic chronic illnesses, when the whole machine gets sluggish instead of one part. The tricky bit? Many of these don't show instantly on the outside. They surface through energy dips, mobility issues, chronic fatigue, immune flare-ups, pain behavior management, or cognitive fog, which is exactly what it sounds like. You know, like trying to think through mashed potatoes. And one of the most emotionally taxing parts of a chronic diagnosis isn't the condition itself. It's what you lose along the way. Routine, spontaneity, uncomplicated mornings, travel without planning 72 contingency scenarios, the ability to run palace laps for charity at 6 a.m. without regretting your entire life by 7 a.m. Of course, Charles never exactly struck us as a sprinter, but even his brisk walk through the garden energy has been challenged recently, and that shift hasn't gone unnoticed. That begs the question, how exactly does illness express itself when you can't kneel to it? Imagine being King Charles for a moment. No, you don't actually need to like gardening or classical music for this exercise. You wake up knowing the world expects continuity. A royal diary is more structured than airport security. It has fixed public appearances, ceremonial obligations, international diplomacy, speeches, letters, rituals, inaugurations, meetings that start exactly 2 seconds after tea is served, announcements that need 38 approvals before anyone smiles, Outfits pre-selected for engagements happening in 3 fiscal years. So you don't call in sick. You power through it. But the human body? It's freestyle jazz. Symptoms show up like surprise fatigue slams, unexpected pain flares, stiffness that wasn't there yesterday, energy low like your internal battery has filed for early retirement, immune setbacks, irregular sleep, pace changes, loss of stamina, side effects from treatment plans, good days that feel pretty decent, bad days that feel like betrayal. Now imagine trying to balance that against an institution built on predictability. And chronic illness isn't linear. It behaves like a mischievous cat, reasonable one day, absolute menace the next. So yes, the illness is devastating. But what's equally compelling is how the monarchy responds when the king himself is running on management mode. And that brings us to an unavoidable subplot. The psychological toll. We don't say enough about how health shifts reshape identity. Not the public identity. Not King Charles, monarch, son of Elizabeth II, global figure of protocol, heritage, and diplomacy. But Charles, the person. The man who waited 70+ years to ascend, navigate a new era, modernize a centuries-old institution, balance family turbulence, launch sustainability projects, shape his legacy, and maybe finally enjoy the perks of being king after decades of preparation. And then suddenly, health says, hold my stethoscope. Chronic conditions impose a permanent reframing of what strength means. You're not weak. You're strategic. There's grief in a diagnosis like this. Not dramatic weeping in a balcony grief. Quiet, recalibration grief. The toll can manifest through emotional strain, worrying about impact on institution, reflections on mortality, responsibilities left incomplete, boots that suddenly feel heavier to walk in, mental exhaustion from constant health awareness, adjustment to limitations, sense of personal loss, fear of future unknowns, shift in daily patterns, public scrutiny pressure, and psychological strain isn't a symptom, it's a consequence. The monarchy survives because royals don't bow out. They carry on. They adapt. They manage. They mask discomfort behind formal calm because it's what the world recognizes, even when it comes at a cost. But the cost is real. And now, the million-dollar royal question. How does someone lead while battling something they can't defeat? When illness doesn't have a cure, strength doesn't mean pushing past it. It means surviving beside it. Charles's leadership style, since his mother's reign transition, has evolved. Before, high-intensity engagements, endless appearances, back-to-back scheduling, global tours, sustainability activism woven into everything. Now, intentional pacing, strategic appearances, subtle delegation, modified engagements, adaptive rest windows, more considered public presence, emphasis on continuity without collapse. Management teaches a person to prioritize. And while illness has redefined his stamina, it's also forced a monarchy-level operational pivot. Reliance on medical advisors for calendars. Revised scheduling priorities. Emphasis on high-impact events over frequency of appearance. Delegation where appropriate. Family members stepping in strategically. Maintenance of institutional presence. Resilience messaging subtly reinforced. Adaptive engagement planning. Public continuity assured through structured appearances. Private routines optimized around health management. Emotional weight carried quietly. Leadership maintained publicly. Institutional flexibility balancing tradition and necessity. Dying headlines are the language of shock journalism, not patient diagnostics. But the emotional punch in the phrase, utterly devastating, feels painfully tangible, because even incremental limitations feel tragic when one has carried an institution for decades. But it's also made him sharper. Sharper at choosing battles. Sharper at choosing moments. Sharper at choosing legacy points. Because chronic illness forces strategy. And while he never has to explain, the body quietly instructs differently than duty ever could. But as citizens, spectators, and followers of this royal institution, we can't help but wonder, what becomes of legacy when illness becomes permanent context? Will historians call this a health crisis? Probably. Will they call it a rallying moment? Possibly. But will they acknowledge it as devastating? Undoubtedly. Because legacy is built on continuity, and illness threatens continuity. But Charles hasn't stepped back. His reign will likely be remembered not as the short chapter, but as the adaptation chapter. A pivot in legacy could look like this. Before diagnosis legacy plan. Transform monarchy, environmental leadership, global diplomacy, modernization, next era institution building. After illness legacy plan. Continuity under strain, leadership through management, legacy refined not by frequency, but impact, monarchy anchored despite limitation. And while we may not know exactly what the condition is, the bigger truth has already surfaced. Charles is not battling for victory, he's battling for stability. But stability, while strategically sound, is emotionally heartbreaking when framed against a lifetime of preparation for a role that doesn't allow retreat. But what if survival becomes the legacy itself? What comes next? The unspoken question hanging in palace air. Chronic illness doesn't roll credits, it opens a new timeline. You don't recover from a diagnosis like this. You reorganize life around it. And royal institutions can reorganize around duty. But the human heart behind duty is where the devastation lives. Quietly, privately, permanently contextualized. The real cliffhanger isn't what illness Charles has. It's how history handles a monarch whose body forces him to lead through strategy, not stamina. And we can't help but wonder. How does the monarchy evolve if survival itself becomes the most public royal act of all? The crown doesn't cure, but it endures. The monarchy isn't built on perfection. It's built on presence. And Charles's presence remains. Not symptom-free, not pain-free, not fatigue-free, but present. Present like old oak architecture that doesn't bend. Present like stability built stone by stone. Present like a man who's playing long-game diplomacy with his own biology. And that's where devastation lives. Not in disappearance, but in continuous negotiation. But let's be honest. The negotiation alone is heartbreaking. But we still watch. Because we're wired to watch continuity. Even tinged with tragedy. Because tragedy at this scale doesn't detach us. It humanizes royalty more than any scandal could. And the world feels the toll, even when the king carries on with formal calm. But what does calm look like when it costs stamina to maintain it? And maybe that's the most devastating discovery of all, not the illness itself, but what the illness quietly forces beneath a crown. Illness with no cure doesn't define the person. How a person survives with it does. And Charles is surviving. In the most monarchy-specific way possible. With pacing, with structure, with strategy, and with continuity. The devastating part? Continuity costs him something we'll never see in full medical charts. But we feel the toll anyway. Because crowns don't conquer biology, but humans negotiate with it daily. And Charles negotiating, while leading an institution built on permanence, is the heartbreaking paradox the palace holds quietly under gold wallpaper. But paradox alone doesn't close a chapter. It opens one.